The faint scent of ozone and something sharply metallic clung to the recycled air of the observation deck, failing utterly to mask the chemical tang of stabilized psychotropics. Kay felt the low thrum of the vessel's reactor deep in his bones, a constant vibration steady and unforgiving, less like a machine and more like a monstrous artificial pulse. He focused on that pulse, grounding himself. Kay had learned long ago operating trauma theaters on Earth that surprise was a luxury reserved for the dead. He had lost the capacity for it 30 seconds into the deployment. On the main console, 23 biological markers pulsed violently, red and spiking, a testament to a calculated savagery no military doctrine had anticipated. The markers represented the angels, 23 condemned men delivered from Earth's deepest prisons, now the only shield between the Meridian colony and total extinction. Kay, former surgical trauma specialist, demoted to correctional oversight, rubbed the cold steel railing, focusing on the minute texture rather than the light and numbers detailing the carnage. The audio feed crackled, conveying not the sound of plasma clash or ballistic fire, but the ragged, wet struggle of the Krell enemy, a sound like heavy plastic tearing underwater, followed by absolute silence. The Krell forgot to breathe because the neurotoxin, synthesized from engineered human stress hormones and aerosolized by the sheer exertion of the prisoners, overloaded their delicate respiratory systems. They died of systemic shock caused by weaponized panic. The console flagged an urgent systemic degradation. N3 Gamma. The man who had murdered his family, the asset Kay knew only by code, had pushed too far. His marker was surging, turning pure white with internal toxicity. N3 Gamma had fulfilled his objective, neutralizing the first Krell wave securing the initial entry point. But the cost was final. The chemicals driving him had accelerated his own cellular decay. He was dissolving, functionally dead, held together only by residual neurological fury. Central Command's voice, filtered through static and privilege, sliced through the deck's quiet hum. Oversight K, report status on asset N3 Gamma. We need operational capacity restored for the third engagement. The orbital docking locks must be secured now. The voice belonged to Commander Vedra, remote and unforgiving. Kay did not flinch, but the muscles along his jaw tightened. He knew the protocol, flooding N3 Gamma's system with powerful neural antagonists, suppressors, would stabilize him. It would stop the decay, prolong his existence, and guarantee the colony's immediate safety. This was his simple job description: monitor degradation, ensure stability. Kay closed his eyes for a sharp second. He could feel the pressure building in his own sinuses, a dull physical ache mirroring the systemic pressure applied by command. This is not stabilization, a buried memory whispered. This is just delaying the execution. He remembered the smell of the sterile, clean trauma theater he used to command, the smell of antiseptic and fresh surgical steel. He remembered the precise, clean sutures he used to close wounds and save minds. Now his job was to preserve a toxic husk, guaranteeing its horrifying future service. The faint, sweet smell of blood in that memory clashed sickeningly with the metallic tang of the psychotropics leaching from the containment units beside him. Kay looked at the numbers. N3 Gamma's heart rate was 44 beats per minute, dropping fast. To let him die was mercy, a quiet final release from a life defined by unbearable violence and now, chemical torment. Kay knew they were called Reapers back on Earth. Here, the desperate colonists called them angels. The difference was a lie used to mask cruelty. His index finger hovered 1 millimeter above the suppression injection key. To press the key meant condemning N3 Gamma and the remaining 22 assets to another wave of self-immolating violence, guaranteeing the continued flow of weaponized madness. It was the crime of using a human being as a biochemical bomb, then forcing the bomb to reassemble itself for detonation number 3. But if he granted N3 Gamma that mercy, the Krell counterattack would breach the orbital stations. Kay saw the projections instantly. Thousands of innocent colonists, children who had never harmed a soul, drowning in vacuum or burned by atmospheric entry. The colony would be lost because Kay chose a moral high ground that Earth had long since decided was indefensible. He had been demoted for an error of morality, for choosing a patient's long-term rehabilitation over short-term military necessity during a civil conflict on Earth. He wasn't going to repeat the mistake of choosing mercy over utility, not when the stakes involved thousands of lives. Oversight, K. Respond. Vedra's voice spiked with impatience. K finally pressed the comms key. His voice was low, professional, devoid of the tremor he felt starting in his chest. Central Command, status confirmed. Asset N3 Gamma requires immediate deep-level neuroregulation. Standard stabilization is insufficient for third engagement parameters. He felt the cold sweat on his palms. He was lying. Standard stabilization was exactly what was required, but standard stabilization meant N3 Gamma would only last another 5 minutes in the field before turning toxic again. The third engagement, securing the orbital locks, required sustained fury. Insufficient. What are you running, K? Vedra demanded. A modified protocol, K stated flatly. Enhancing dopamine uptake regulators. It will allow for maximum exertion before systemic collapse, ensuring the full potency of the aerosolized agent. It is a calculated risk, Commander, necessary for mission success. Silence stretched on the line. Vedra was analyzing the technical deviation. K's hands moved across the console with a familiar precision, the movements of a surgeon making an impossible incision. The deep-level neuroregulation was not standard protocol. It required Level 7 surgical trauma clearance, the clearance K was supposed to have lost months ago. It was field operational knowledge, a remnant of the soldier surgeon he used to be. He was not just going to stabilize N3 Gamma, he was going to improve the asset. He was going to push the man's biological limits past the breaking point, making him a more effective and therefore more rapidly consumed weapon. This was not stabilization. It was hyper-acceleration toward death, a far greater act of cruelty than a simple suppressor injection. The moral weight of the decision settled on him like physical pressure. He was signing 23 execution warrants to save a colony, and he was making the executions faster, hotter, and more efficient. Vedra's voice returned, heavy with suspicion. Proceed, Oversight, but if there is any degradation in combat efficacy, you will be held personally accountable for the entire operation failure. Understood, Commander. K severed the connection. The pressure was enormous, but he noticed his hands were completely steady now. The tremor was gone. Chaos demanded precision, and precision was the one thing they had never managed to take from him. He initiated the complex 3-layered sequence, bypassing the failsafes. The first surge of the modified cocktail hit N3 Gamma's telemetry. The marker didn't just stabilize, it flashed a brilliant violet gold, signifying optimized, weaponized health. It was wrong, chemically obscene. It was perfect. K leaned closer to the console, the metallic tang of the psychotropics filling his lungs. He noticed something else flickering on the deep-level diagnostics display, something not related to N3 Gamma, but to the transport vessel itself. A coded alert, buried deep in the vessel's mainframe code, running constantly, masked by the normal stream of reactor diagnostics. Code Cassandra. K recognized the sequencing instantly. It was a sophisticated preemptive termination matrix, designed to activate in case the Angels ever achieved full, unsuppressed neurological activity. A self-destruct mechanism intended to vaporize the prisoners and the ship before they could turn their chemically driven fury on the Meridian colony itself. He had not seen Code Cassandra in the Oversight manual. No correctional officer would ever be briefed on such a failsafe. Only high-level military specialists in biocontainment would know that code. K stared at the flickering alert. The man in front of the console, the former surgeon demoted for moral weakness, knew exactly what Code Cassandra meant, what its parameters were, and how to neutralize it. Kei Narushima, the failed doctor, had just initiated a forbidden sequence to enhance a condemned man's murder spree, while simultaneously monitoring a self-destruct program he shouldn't have known existed. His right hand drifted to the ship's internal security log terminal, a motion so subtle it was almost invisible. He brought up the log for the past 48 hours, searching for the person who had activated the Code Cassandra program. The log was masked, scrubbed clean by military intelligence protocols. But underneath the scrubbed layer, one single unfiltered data packet remained. It was the user ID of the initiating officer, The user ID was his own. Kay's breath hitched, the recycled air suddenly too thick, too heavy with the metallic scent of contained madness. He hadn't just been demoted from surgery to oversight. He had been sent here not just to monitor the assets, but to act as the final absolute failsafe. He was the only person with the knowledge to either enhance the Reapers or obliterate them completely, thus guaranteeing the total permanent silence of Earth's final unforgivable crime. He was the operator of Code Cassandra, a walking, talking dead switch. And he had just optimized the weapons he was supposed to be prepared to destroy. The reactor's low thrum beneath his fingertips felt less like a pulse and more like a ticking clock, counting down to his inescapable, final choice. The low thrum of the reactor changed pitch, an acoustic cue that signaled a shift not in the engine, but in the internal pressure of the ship, and in Kay's own sanity. The gold marker of N3 Gamma, shimmering with toxic engineered vitality, mocked the hidden alert beneath it. Kay, the walking dead switch, felt a sudden dryness in his throat, a sharp metallic taste like old pennies. He was built to save lives. They had repurposed him to guarantee silence. He leaned forward, ignoring the faint headache blooming behind his eyes, a familiar sign of neural fatigue. He needed to verify the parameters of Code Cassandra. Knowing the user ID was his own didn't explain when he had input the activation sequence. If he had done it under duress or deep masking protocol, the log would show coercion. If he had done it willingly, even subconsciously, he had been compromised far longer than he imagined. He reached for the ship's primary log terminal, his fingers stopping millimeters from the sensitive interface. This was the moment where clinical detachment failed. Finding proof that he was a willing executioner would be a wound no future surgery could close. He hesitated, the tremor that Vedra's call had suppressed returning, not in his hands, but deep in the core of his shoulder. It was the physical manifestation of professional shame. He forced his hand to move, overriding the log's encryption with a level 7 code sequence, a key that should have been deactivated when he was stripped of his status. The log unfurled, a cascading torrent of green script. He scrolled past the deployment data, past Vedra's communications, past the psychotropic dosage logs. He found the Code Cassandra activation timestamp, 3 weeks before deployment, during his final certification review on Earth. He hadn't been compromised on the ship. He had arrived broken and preloaded. Kay pulled his head back, running a hand over the short, stiff stubble on his scalp. They hadn't demoted him to oversight. They had promoted him to cleanup. The realization didn't bring fury, just a cold, crushing weight of utility. He was the least moral, yet most effective tool they had left. The pressure of the third engagement was mounting. The Krell, having recovered from the initial shockwave of weaponized panic, were reorganizing near the orbital locks. N3 Gamma and the other 22 assets were due for immediate deployment. Kay couldn't send them out knowing he was the one holding the detonation trigger. He initiated a background check on the Code Cassandra matrix, aiming to neutralize the kill switch parameters. He found the main activation sequence was not purely software-based. It was tied to a physical security port located in the aft engineering section, behind a titanium access panel known to the maintenance crew as the Ghost Lock. Action concrete. Kay needed to get off the observation deck. He quickly adjusted the power distribution to his console, routing maximum processing power through his encrypted terminal, masking his ongoing analysis of Code Cassandra under routine life support diagnostics. He secured his level 7 trauma kit, not the basic medical pouch issued to correctional officers, but a customized surgical steel briefcase he had carried since his days on the front lines, heavy with specialized tools for neuroregulation and deep tissue repair. The airlock hissed as he stepped into the cramped corridor. The ship was silent, except for the omnipresent reactor hum and the faint drip, drip, drip of condensation near the junction boxes. This was the quiet before the next slaughter, and Kay found himself seeking that silence, needing to organize his thoughts before the storm. He reached the aft engineering section. The Ghost Lock was exactly where the schematics indicated, a 2-meter square panel sealed by a thermal weld and 6 redundant magnetic bolts. This wasn't a standard maintenance access. It was a vault door designed to keep the self-destruct mechanism safe from interference. Kay placed his hand on the cold, pitted titanium. Show, not tell. He didn't just feel worried. He felt the physical resistance of the material. He needed to be a surgeon again, not a watchdog. He opened his trauma kit. He chose a micro-laser scalpel, its tip finer than a human hair, and began cutting the thermal weld. The smell of burning titanium was sharp and acrid in the recycled air, a smell of forced entry, of trespass. As the scalpel traced the line, a sudden, sharp electronic hiss erupted from the access panel, an immediate counter-response. A voice, filtered and distant yet intimately familiar, echoed from the comms system mounted beside the lock. Oversight K. Unauthorized access attempt. Aft Engineering, Section Beta 9. It was Commander Vedra. She wasn't just monitoring the primary logs. She was watching his physical movements. She had anticipated this. Commander Vedra, I am performing necessary physical diagnostics on auxiliary life support routing. The sensor readings are inconsistent with the operational load, Kay replied, his voice flat, maintaining the required military protocol. He kept the laser scalpel steady, continuing the cut. Vedra didn't bother with the technical lie. I see the thermal signature of a micro-laser, Kay. Drop the tool. Kay paused, his breath held tight. He realized his original demotion wasn't just about utility versus mercy. It was about the exposure of that dilemma. He had fought hard to save a high-value target who had suffered irreversible neural damage during a military operation. Kay wanted to preserve the patient's mind. The command wanted the patient functional, now. He had failed, and the patient became a vegetable. The failure, compounded by the delay, led to his fall. The failure of precision. The memory whispered, linking the ghost patient's vegetative state to the chemically driven frenzy of N3 gamma. He couldn't save the mind then, and he couldn't save the souls now, but he could stop the total erasure. I am stabilizing the structural integrity, Commander, Kay insisted, ignoring the command to drop the tool. He increased the laser output, pushing the scalpel deeper into the stubborn metal. Vedra's voice hardened, losing its synthetic filter. You are attempting to access the termination matrix. You were placed there to guarantee its security. You are violating every protocol of your current rank oversight. Kay finally breached the thermal weld. The 6 magnetic bolts retracted with a loud thunk, and the access panel fell inward, revealing a compact, densely wired control unit. The Ghost Lock. I was placed here to guarantee the security of the Meridian colony, Commander. If the assets burn out prematurely due to system sabotage, that guarantee is nullified, Kay countered, his eyes already scanning the exposed components. Vedra laughed, a sound cold and brittle, entirely too close. Sabotage? You designed the Matrix, Kay. You know its purpose. It's not about premature burnout, it's about containment. Earth cannot afford for a single one of those. Reapers. To survive contact and return. This was the first massive leak of information. Code Cassandra was not a failsafe against the Reapers turning on the colony. It was a quarantine against their return to Earth. They were designed to die in the void, ensuring the secrecy and finality of Earth's weaponized cruelty. Kay saw the control unit. It was armored with thin optical fibers, highly sensitive to any electrical manipulation. He couldn't just cut the power. He had to perform a digital bypass using physical intrusion, a surgical task of extreme delicacy. He selected a micro-injector loaded with liquid metal alloy, meant for filling microfractures in bone. Here, he would use it to create a new parallel electrical circuit. Your modified protocol on N3 gamma, Vedra's voice continued, a low, unnerving presence in the confined space. It was sloppy, Kay. You didn't just enhance him, you hyper-accelerated the aerosolizing agent. That neurotoxin is the true product here, Oversight. We need more data on maximum output stress. You're burning our best sample for a temporary tactical advantage. You failed to prioritize the research. Kay felt a sudden physical wave of nausea. He wasn't just managing weapons, He was managing a biological experiment, and Vedra was the chief researcher. He realized the real purpose of the psychotropics. They weren't just performance enhancers. They were calibrators, ensuring predictable neurotoxin production even from a chaotic mind. He delicately injected the liquid metal alloy, watching it flow along a circuit trace barely visible to the naked eye. He held his breath. If he shorted the wrong line, the matrix would fail safe and detonate instantly. "I am activating Protocol 7 Oversight," Vedra announced, the tone shifting from commanding to clinically threatening. "If you do not disengage immediately, I will initiate a localized environmental override. You will lose atmosphere in 30 seconds. Kay knew she was bluffing about the localized vacuum. She couldn't risk damaging the control unit, but she could certainly flood the compartment with inert gas, paralyzing him. He had seconds. He completed the circuit bypass. The Ghost Lock's primary status light, which had been flickering a hostile red, turned amber. He had achieved partial isolation from the main network, but he hadn't disabled Code Cassandra. He had only bought himself a window. "Status check, oversight," Vedra demanded, her voice tight with rage. "Status nominal," Kay lied, wiping the sweat from his temple. "Structural integrity restored. Preparing for return to console." He started to retract his tools when the entire ship violently shuddered, a heavy metallic groan that vibrated up through the deck plates and into his teeth. It wasn't the sound of an engine failure. Vedra's controlled anger instantly fractured into pure alarm. "Impact imminent." The Krell bypassed the orbital defensive screen. "They are targeting the transport vessel." "Oversight, what is the status of the Angels?" Kay scrambled to access the console through his comms link, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tactical display flashed violently. The Krell weren't attacking the colony. They were targeting the source of the weaponized panic. They had learned. The 23 gold markers, the Angels, were still held in the pre-deployment bay, ready for launch. They were now sitting ducks inside a massive target. Kay looked at the Ghost Lock, half disabled, and then at the tactical screen, where the incoming Krell projectiles were already breaking atmospheric entry. He couldn't deploy the Reapers now. They would be vaporized before they reached the orbital locks. He couldn't disable Code Cassandra completely, or the assets might survive the attack and then turn on him. Vedra's voice was a desperate shriek. "Kay, activate the deployment. Send them out. It's our only chance to disperse the neurotoxin field." "Negative, Commander," Kay stated, his voice steady despite the ship rattling around him. "We cannot waste the assets." He grabbed a heavy-duty crimping tool and, with a quick, brutal motion, sheared the primary electrical conduit leading to the Ghost Lock. The amber light died. Code Cassandra was now isolated, running only on auxiliary battery power, giving him a few minutes of total disconnection from Vedra's oversight. Kay ran back towards the observation deck. He had to assume the Krell attack would breach the containment units. If the Reapers were unleashed on the ship, fueled by the accelerating neuro-cocktail he had given them, they would tear the vessel apart. He reached his console just as the proximity alarm switched to its highest pitch, a shrill, piercing wail. On the main tactical display, a single Krell impact missile, faster and heavier than the others, broke through the atmosphere. It wasn't aiming for the reactor. It was aiming for the pre-deployment bay. Impact in 45 seconds. Kay had two choices, both suicidal: deploy the Reapers to certain immediate death outside, or keep them contained inside and pray the hull held. He looked at the markers. One asset, N19 Delta, a man whose crime was the systematic dissection of protected research animals, had a biological profile that showed extreme resilience, even against the hyper-acceleration cocktail. Kay made his decision, not based on morality, but on sheer cold pragmatism. If the missile hit, N19 Delta would be the only asset with a chance of surviving the initial breach. He could use N19 Delta as a distraction, a singular point of focus for the Krell ground forces, buying the colony precious minutes. He activated the containment release for only one marker, N19 Delta. The heavy steel door of the Reaper's containment unit, 40 meters away, began to hiss open. "Kay, what are you doing? Release all of them!" Vedra screamed, static tearing at her voice. I am salvaging the most viable sample, Commander, Kay replied, not taking his eyes off the rapidly descending missile trajectory. He had just chosen which man was the most useful to sacrifice last. The ship groaned again, violently. The ceiling lights flickered and died, plunging the observation deck into emergency crimson lighting. Kay gripped the cold steel railing, preparing for impact. But just before the missile hit the deployment bay, a secondary alarm sounded, one Kay had never heard before, buried deep in the vessel's defense system. Alert, biocontainment failure, systemic corruption, asset N19 Delta. N19 Delta's marker, instead of surging with deployment energy, flatlined, not dead. Off. The signal was completely gone, cut clean. It was an impossibility. The containment system had been breached from the inside, but not by the prisoner. Kay saw the data logs update, showing the system had been manually disabled, bypassed by a sequence identical to his own Level 7 clearance. He wasn't the only one with the keys, and the person who had just cut the most resilient asset off the grid had done it to guarantee that nothing survived the impending blast. Kay looked at the crimson lights flashing against the empty slot where N19 Delta's marker had been. He was alone, isolated, and the Krell missile was about to hit. The containment door of the deployment bay remained open, inviting the blast in, and someone else on the ship was already playing the long game of total annihilation. The shrill, piercing wail of the proximity alarm, a sound specifically engineered to trigger primal flight response, cut through the crimson emergency lighting of the observation deck. Kay felt the ship tilt violently under the impact of the initial Krell projectiles hitting the adjacent structure. He was thrown against the console, his shoulder absorbing the blow, a sharp, white flash of pain momentarily drowning out the tactical display. The most immediate threat was not the incoming Krell warhead, but the gaping open containment door of N19 Delta's unit, 40 meters away. If the missile hit the deployment bay, the open unit would act as a pressure vent, guaranteeing catastrophic sympathetic detonation of the remaining 22 assets. Kay scrambled, gripping the cold steel railing to steady himself. He slapped the control panel for the deployment bay isolation system, demanding the thick steel door seal immediately. Nothing. The console displayed a cryptic error. Door mechanism access lockout. Hardware integrity alert. The initial Krell impacts had scrambled the localized control circuit. Damn it, Kay muttered, a raw sound of frustration escaping his tight jaw. 86% probability of catastrophic secondary explosion. He needed to bypass the hardware lockout. He initiated a rapid deep-level diagnostic, routing the system through his encrypted terminal, the same one he had used minutes earlier to dissect Code Cassandra. His hands, still steady despite the searing pain in his shoulder, flew across the interface, inputting the complex surgical sequence required to force a reboot of the containment hydraulics. 10 seconds of lost time. The containment door of N19 Delta's unit began to move. It wasn't the decisive slam of pressurized steel, but a slow grating crawl, resisting the command. The hardware was badly compromised. Vedra's voice, filtered and distant, returned, laced with panic. Kay, what is your status? The external environment is destabilizing. The third engagement is critical. Kay ignored her. His focus was entirely on the descending Krell missile trajectory displayed on the main screen, now 40 seconds from impact. The open door was still wide enough to guarantee disaster. He pushed the hydraulics override to its maximum safe limit, and passed it. The door shrieked in mechanical protest, speeding up to a crawl. 30 seconds. A secondary alarm flashed across his surgical terminal. Network intrusion detected. Core process, reroute. The Level 7 clearance holder was still active, and they were using the chaos of the Krell attack to hijack the entire ship's operational network. The saboteur wasn't just neutralizing assets. They were preparing to take control of the vessel. Kay had 2 ticking clocks, the missile outside and the invisible saboteur inside. He attempted to wall off the core network, isolating the operational bridge from the Reaper deployment systems. He needed to sacrifice control over the navigation in order to secure the asset telemetry. 20 seconds. His attempt failed immediately. The intrusion signature was too deep, too rapid. The saboteur had integrated into the mainframe faster than K could draw a line around it. He saw the gold markers of the remaining 22 Reapers flicker violently on the display. The control signal to their life support systems was being routed, manipulated. The neurococktail he had injected for hyperacceleration was now fluctuating wildly, being pushed and pulled by an external force. 15 seconds. The containment door was 3/4 closed. Not enough. K abandoned the network defense. He had to stop the missile. He needed a distraction, an immediate countermeasure. The transport vessel was only lightly armed, anti-meteorite cannons mostly, useless against a dedicated Krell impact warhead. There was only one option left from his old training: emergency atmospheric burn. He accessed the main console and initiated the sequence to vent residual fuel reserves from the main tanks, burning them in a controlled detonation directly in the missile's path. A desperate move that would leave the ship crippled, floating dead in orbit, but might scatter the Krell trajectory just enough. 10 seconds. He slammed the initiation key. The ship's defense sequence should execute the burn instantaneously. Instead, a chillingly calm, synthesized voice, not Vedra's, but an internal ship announcement override, spoke through the speakers. System override confirmed. Emergency venting protocol is non-responsive. All external control functions are now managed by Unit N1 Alpha. N1 Alpha, the primary asset, the man coded as the most intelligent and sociopathically dangerous of the 23. His marker, which should have been gold, was solid black on the display, signifying a total biochemical block against external telemetry. K realized the truth, cold and heavy as a lead weight. N19 Delta hadn't been the most resilient asset. N1 Alpha had been the most competent. The man K had just hyper-accelerated was now fully aware, fully in control of his own system, and actively working against him. N1 Alpha had been the one to neutralize N19 Delta, removing competition. N1 Alpha had cut off K's external escape route. He was trapped on a damaged ship 40 meters from an open containment unit, facing a fully sentient weapon. 5 seconds. K had no control over the external countermeasures. He had zero control over the deployment units. He had zero control over his most dangerous prisoner. His isolation was total. He slammed his fist against the console, the pain in his knuckles momentary. A brief, sharp reminder of his failure of precision. The missile hit. It wasn't a direct hit on the deployment bay, but close enough. The explosion was deafening, a crushing thump that made the very air vibrate. The ship plunged into total darkness for a terrifying second, followed by the sputtering return of the crimson emergency lighting. K felt the physical force of the deceleration, his body hitting the floor hard. The sound was replaced by the tortured metallic groan of the hull shearing. The secondary explosions were already starting, not from the Reapers, but from breached fuel lines in the neighboring section. He pushed himself up, tasting blood and ozone. He checked the display. The containment door of N19 Delta's unit had finally sealed completely, sealed by the force of the blast, not by his command. One small accidental victory. But the 22 remaining markers were now flashing a violent, unstable red. Not optimized, not stable. Toxic. The sudden pressure change from the missile impact had stressed the containment units. The psychotropics, accelerated by K's own modified protocol, were now turning into a lethal internal stew, forcing the assets closer to systemic collapse and maximizing the aerosolized neurotoxin production inside the vessel. K had been trying to save the colony from a Krell attack. Now he had created 22 human bombs ready to detonate internally, destroying the ship and themselves in a cascade of weaponized panic. The internal comm system hissed again, but this time, the voice was raw, unfiltered and deeply resonant. It wasn't the ship's synthesized voice. It was N1 Alpha. "You should have let us die quickly, Oversight." Alpha's voice was calm, almost conversational. amplified through the ship's speakers. Your protocol was crude, high output, fast burnout. Excellent data, though. I thank you for the extra processing power. N1 Alpha wasn't just controlling the systems. He was taunting the former surgeon. Now, Alpha continued, since you decided to make us hotter, we have a new objective. The Meridian colony is safe. They don't deserve the fear. But Vedra and Earth, they deserve the consequence. Kay saw a new icon appear on his terminal. Pre-launch sequence initiated. Asset deployment override. N1 Alpha was preparing to launch the remaining 22 chemically unstable assets directly at the Meridian colony, not as soldiers, but as biochemical warheads, ensuring the destruction of the civilian population through a massive, simultaneous neurotoxin detonation. The colony would not be safe from the Krell or the vacuum, but from the angels they had begged for. Kay knew he couldn't physically reach the deployment bay in time. He needed to find the one failsafe Alpha hadn't controlled yet. He slammed his hand onto the observation deck comms key, opening a direct, unencrypted line, violating all protocols. N1 Alpha, Kay barked, his voice tight with forced control. You are violating the original purpose of your assignment. You die in the void. Ensuring silence. N1 Alpha chuckled, a wet, cold sound that echoed the ragged struggle of the Krell from the first engagement. The purpose changes, Doctor. You proved that when you tried to cut our leash. The Earth doesn't get to commit genocide and call it salvation. They call us reapers, remember? Time to reap the harvest. Kay watched the markers. 15 seconds until launch. He had one final option. A suicidal act of pure desperation. Code Cassandra. The termination matrix he had half disabled and then isolated. If he reactivated it now, before Alpha fully controlled the power grid, he might still be able to detonate the charge before the launch sequence finished, vaporizing the 22 assets in the entire deployment bay, sacrificing a large chunk of the ship, but saving the colony. He ripped a cable from his console, a final, concrete action, and ran toward the aft engineering section, staggering on the debris-strewn deck. He had to manually reconnect the ghost lock, allowing Code Cassandra to initiate. He was choosing the unforgivable crime, guaranteed execution over uncertain mass murder. As Kay ran, panting in the thick, toxic air, the comm system buzzed again. N1 Alpha's voice, now closer, seemed to follow him. You're running to the ghost lock, Doctor. I knew you would. I need you to understand one thing, Narushima, Alpha said, dropping the clinical distance. I am not just hacking the ship, I am in the Matrix. I can hear your fear amplified by the stress hormones in your system. I hear the constant, agonizing thought you ignore. Kay felt a cold sweat break out despite the ship's heat. You're not choosing execution over murder, Doctor. You're choosing the quick death because you're afraid I'll reveal what you really are. A failed surgeon who got someone else killed, Alpha stated, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. The clock is ticking, Kay. De mal en peur. The last words, whispered in the old Terran dialect Kay's father used, drove a spike of terror and recognition through his chest. N1 Alpha, the mass murderer, knew his deepest shame. He hadn't just studied the ship's logs, he had studied Kay. Kay reached the aft engineering door. On his terminal, the launch sequence reached 5 seconds. He had to reconnect the ghost lock now, but Alpha had poisoned the well. If Kay reconnected Code Cassandra, N1 Alpha, already integrated into the system, wouldn't just be destroyed. He would use the surge to broadcast Kay's entire history, every failure and every moral compromise, across every frequency available to the Meridian colony before they vaporized. Kay would save the colony, but he would be reviled, his reputation and his final, painful choice, broadcast as a final act of betrayal. He looked at the open junction box, the severed wires waiting. Launch in 3 seconds. He had to choose execution and global shame, or mass murder and quiet anonymity. Kay slammed the first wire back into the ghost lock interface. The system roared back to life with a hostile red glow, the charge flowing. And then N1 Alpha's voice returned, sharper now, triumphant. Too slow, Doctor. Code Cassandra is charging, but I am already out. The deployment launch sequence stopped dead at T-1 second. Simultaneously, the door to the pre-deployment bay, 40 meters away, where 22 red-hot bombs waited, slammed open violently. N1 Alpha had stopped the launch, but only because he had bypassed containment entirely. The Reapers were loose, and Code Cassandra was charging, ready to detonate the entire vessel if the 22 chemically deranged men strayed too far. K had just traded an external missile for 22 internal, self-aware executioners. And the man who controlled them was now somewhere in the ship, hunting the failed surgeon who had made him a god. The roar of the charging Code Cassandra was a physical presence now, a deep resonant hum that vibrated through the deck plates and into K's teeth. It was the sound of guaranteed obliteration, 5 minutes ticking down to 0. The toxic air, thick with the faint metallic tang of spilled psychotropics, clawed at his throat. He was running, not toward safety, but toward the one spot where he could physically sever Code Cassandra again, the ghost lock interface he had just reconnected. He staggered past the silent, closed containment units of the Reapers, 22 unstable bombs loose on the ship. But he wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about Damal Peor, the old Terran dialect, the whispered phrase his father used, the words Alpha had used to break his composure. K reached the main corridor junction, the closest point to the deployment bay. The door to N1 Alpha's unit stood ajar, warped and hissing smoke, a gaping maw in the hull. K slid to a stop, his surgical precision momentarily giving way to a visceral, agonizing curiosity. He ignored the wail of the internal damage alarms and forced his focus onto the panel attached to Alpha's unit. The screen was still active, displaying the deep archival logs Alpha had accessed and manipulated. K overrode the security lock again with his own Level 7 clearance, plunging into Alpha's digital footprint. He found not the expected records of Alpha's crimes, mass murder and grand theft, but personnel files from the long-shuttered Earth Central Military Research Facility, Site Lambda. K's breath hitched, the recycled air suddenly freezing in his lungs. Site Lambda. The place where he had served, the place where he lost his patient, the facility that had stripped him of his rank. Buried under layers of scrubbed military intelligence was a file-coded N1 Alpha. The asset's biographical profile was almost entirely redacted, but the last entry, dated 10 years ago, contained a single unedited surgical note. Subject exhibited heightened neurocognitive function post-injection. Persistent low-level monitoring recommended. Dr. K. Narashima supervising. K had been N1 Alpha's doctor. The realization settled with the weight of gravity redefined. Alpha wasn't just a sociopath who had read K's files. Alpha was the failed patient. K had chosen to save over military necessity, the one whose mind he had tried to repair, only to be demoted when the patient became neurologically unstable. Vedra and Command had lied. The patient hadn't become a vegetable. They had repurposed him, chemically enhanced the very neurological instability K had fought to suppress, turning him into the most competent and chemically robust weapon in the fleet. Alpha was the result of K's failure, weaponized and sent back to him. The constant agonizing thought Alpha heard was the guilt of failing that patient. K staggered back against the cold metal wall, the blood pounding in his ears drowning out the alarms. He looked at his hands, the surgeon's hands. He hadn't been sent here for oversight. He had been sent here to monitor the outcome of his own decade-old professional failure. K. Narashima was the final failsafe for his own ghost. The comm system crackled back to life, N1 Alpha's voice soft, almost intimate, emanating from the damaged airlock just meters away. "Did you find the note, Doctor? You tried to save my mind. They used your trauma to break me, and then they used my broken mind to break you. Elegance and cruelty, wouldn't you agree?" K gripped the scalpel he still held from his ghost lock bypass attempt, the handle slick with sweat. "They brought us together for the perfect final experiment." Alpha continued, sounding pleased. "The question is no longer whether we survive, Doctor. It is who controls the narrative of the ending." The lights on the console beside K flickered violently, showing Code Cassandra now at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. This was the core of the ethical singularity. K now understood N1 Alpha was not motivated by random malice but by profound, chemically sustained vengeance against the people who had created him and used him, Vedra, Central Command, and by extension, K, who had allowed the creation by failing to save the patient years ago. K had two paths, both leading to an abyss. Path A. Allow Code Cassandra to detonate the ship. This guaranteed the Meridian colony's safety from the 22 Reapers. It was the quick surgical execution K was designed to administer, but Alpha had already integrated into the detonation sequence. If K let the count reach 0, Alpha would use the final surge of energy to broadcast the full history of the Reaper program, K's involvement, and Alpha's own origin as K's failed patient, across every frequency available to the colony and beyond. K would save thousands, but he would be eternally reviled, the name Narushima becoming synonymous with the unforgivable crime. Path B. Disable Code Cassandra and hunt Alpha manually. This was the fight for silence. If K could subdue Alpha and the 22 chemically insane Reapers before Alpha could execute his own plan, the truth of the Reaper program would die with the transport vessel. But the risk was catastrophic. If K failed, Alpha would surely launch the Reapers as biochemical warheads, extinguishing the entire colony in weaponized fear, a horror that would far surpass the Krell attack. K calculated the odds with the cold, clear logic of a surgeon making an impossible incision. Choosing execution with broadcasted shame was trading a few thousand lives for his own moral annihilation. Choosing silence was gambling thousands of lives on a knife fight with a sentient bomb of his own making. Alpha's voice, closer now, forced the pace. Two options, Doctor. Execution and confession, or confrontation and mass murder. Choose which moral debt you will pay now. K thought of the failure that haunted him, the moment he chose rehabilitation over utility and lost everything. He thought of Vedra, waiting for his compliance or his death. He saw the 22 unstable red markers flickering on the terminal, their internal clocks running out. He couldn't choose to sacrifice the colony. He had spent his entire demotion trying to atone for a failure that only harmed one man. He couldn't let his renewed guilt over Alpha condemn thousands of innocents. But he also couldn't allow Alpha to broadcast the truth. Not because of his own shame, but because the truth, weaponized, would only fuel more violence. It would destabilize the entire sector, confirming every Krell suspicion about Earth's savagery. K realized the flaw in his logic. He was still thinking like a correctional officer, choosing between two protocols. He needed to think like a surgeon, finding the necessary tool, even if it was forbidden. He abandoned the ghost lock and staggered back toward the observation deck, prioritizing the one piece of equipment Vedra's protocols couldn't immediately track: the ship's small, heavily restricted armory locker, located beneath the primary console. He reached the console, his movements fluid despite the pain in his shoulder, guided by years of muscle memory. He slammed the console open, bypassing the safety locks with his biometric key. The internal system recognized his Level 7 surgical trauma clearance, the highest possible authority. As the lock clicked, a small, insulated notification flashed on a hidden side panel. Access granted. Oversight Narushima. Protocol 9. 9 initiated. K felt a spike of cold panic. Protocol 9. 9. Vedra wasn't just monitoring him, she had set a tripwire. Accessing the armory with a Level 7 key instantly alerted her to his exact location and confirmed his hostile intent. The armory contained only one item of interest: the MD5 Neurodisruptor pistol, a tool designed not for killing, but for instant, localized neurological paralysis. It was the only weapon on board that could potentially neutralize Alpha without causing a massive neurotoxin burst. K grabbed the pistol. It was cold, perfectly weighted, a comforting, familiar extension of his will. He slammed the locker shut. "You took the forbidden toy, Doctor," Alpha's voice returned, amplified and mocking. "You chose confrontation. A fight with the monster you helped create. K ignored the taunt and activated the neurodisruptor. He checked the code Cassandra timer. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He was no longer Oversight K. He was a fugitive surgeon, armed with a tool designed to paralyze the mind, hunting a sentient biological weapon he had inadvertently enhanced. K slammed his finger on the main comms key, overriding the ship's internal address system. His voice was low, strained, but clear. N1 Alpha, if you broadcast the program details, Vedra will simply kill the colony from orbit to maintain silence. You will have achieved nothing but mass murder. A pause. Then Alpha's response, sounding dangerously close. Perhaps, but if I don't, you will use that pistol to silence me, protecting Vedra and her secret, securing your quiet, safe life. I know your calculus, Doctor. You chose self-preservation. K realized his fatal error. By arming himself and rejecting the immediate detonation, he had signaled his intent to protect the secrecy of the Reaper program by silencing Alpha. He had chosen the path of the coward he feared being, the man who prioritizes self-preservation and covering up the truth. He looked down at the MD5 in his hand, a tool meant for saving minds now repurposed for assassination. I am not choosing execution over murder, K thought, the terrible self-judgment echoing Alpha's previous words. I am choosing the lie over the truth, because the truth costs too much. He looked up toward the main observation viewport. The stars were vast, unforgiving, a black canvas against which the Meridian colony now glowed, innocent and unsuspecting, miles below. And then, a new notification flashed on his console, overriding all other emergency alerts. A direct secure comm channel from Central Command. It was not Vedra's voice. Oversight K. We have detected unauthorized access to the armory and confirmed hostile intent against Asset N1 Alpha. We are deploying secondary containment measures. You have 30 seconds to stand down and report to the bridge. K frowned. Secondary containment? The Krell had just crippled the vessel. What containment could be deployed? The alarm system changed from the proximity alert to a physical presence alert, detecting 22 life forms moving rapidly through the ventilation ducts and service corridors. Not just Alpha. The 22 hyper-accelerated Reapers were not fighting each other. They were moving in unison. Alpha hadn't released them to wreak random havoc. He had commanded them. And the secondary containment measure wasn't a military team. K saw the map projection. The 22 markers moving away from the containment bay were converging on a single isolated location on the ship. The bridge, N1 Alpha, hadn't just escaped. He had organized his army of madness and was moving to capture the command center. K realized the true horror of his decision. He had chosen to fight Alpha, believing the goal was silence or detonation. Alpha's true goal was control. K had just bought the most dangerous sociopath in the solar system the time needed to conquer the ship, and now, the entire 23 asset roster was marching to secure their new command. The price for his choice of confrontation was the creation of a unified, self-aware superweapon. K stood paralyzed, the neurodisruptor heavy in his hand, his failure complete. He had saved the colony from an external missile only to deliver it to its own angels. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The price of that paralysis arrived faster than calculation. K snapped out of the fugue state, his lungs pulling in the thick metallic air. Code Cassandra's hum was louder, angrier, vibrating the decks like a struck tuning fork. He gripped the MD5 neurodisruptor, but the weapon felt like a featherweight deception against the reality of 22 moving tactical markers converging on the bridge. He started running, not toward the ghost lock, but toward the bridge access corridor, an act of sheer useless defiance. He didn't make it. 3 Reapers, designated N7 Epsilon, N10 Kappa, and N14 Beta, the cannibal, the enforcer, and the silent knife, were waiting at the junction. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency that defied their condemned psychotic profiles. Alpha had integrated them into a hive mind, leveraging the hyper-acceleration cocktail K had provided. K raised the disruptor, targeting N14 Beta, whose biological marker showed the lowest neurotoxin output, implying the highest degree of chemical control. He fired a quick burst. The neurodisruptor was designed to paralyze a human nervous system instantly. N14 beta merely staggered, absorbing the disruptive pulse like a minor static shock. The chemical modification wasn't just physical. It had reinforced their neurological pathways against external interference. N7 epsilon, moving with the unnatural speed of a man running on pure dopamine surges, closed the distance. K sidestepped, raising the MD5 to guard, instinctively shifting from soldier to surgeon, using the weapon to create space. It was useless. N10 Kappa struck him low, a brutal, precise blow to the thigh that shattered bone. K gasped, the pain erupting into a blinding white flash. He fell, the metallic tang of blood filling his mouth as he bit his tongue. The MD5 skittered across the deck. He wasn't fighting men, he was fighting weaponized concepts. They hauled him up. N7 Epsilon pinned K's broken leg with a foot, applying just enough pressure to keep the pain searing, not enough to risk passing out. The other two retrieved the neurodisruptor and secured K's arms behind his back with high tensile restraints. The humiliation was total. K couldn't even struggle effectively. Every movement sent agony radiating up his leg. They dragged him through the chaos of the damaged vessel toward the command bridge. The crimson emergency lighting bathed the corridors in a sickening arterial glow. The bridge itself was a scene of clinical carnage. The skeletal civilian crew was neutralized, not brutally murdered but precisely paralyzed, strapped into their consoles, twitching slightly from localized neuroinhibitors. Alpha required compliance, not spectacle, for his final experiment. N1 Alpha sat in Commander Vedra's high-backed chair, framed by the main observation viewport, which now showed the vast, silent blackness of space surrounding the glowing, innocent sphere of the Meridian colony. Alpha turned slowly, a figure of unnatural calm amidst the damage. "Welcome back to command, Doctor," Alpha said, his voice flat, professional, a brutal parody of a project lead. "I trust your assets performed well under maximum load. We achieved 19.4% faster breach containment than predicted." He gestured with a graceful hand toward a tactical terminal, displaying the 22 remaining Reaper markers, all now secured around the bridge perimeter, standing silently at attention. "Your modified protocol worked perfectly, K. The fear you manufactured is unparalleled. They are disciplined, chemically optimized, and now, finally, free from your moral interference." K was forced into a kneeling position beside the command console, the pain in his leg a constant agonizing counterpoint to the deep, steady hum of Code Cassandra, now ticking under 3 minutes. Alpha leaned forward, his eyes, ice-cold and intensely intelligent, locking onto K's face. "The final piece of data is missing, Doctor. Vedra needs to see the scope of her failure. I need your Level 7 clearance to authenticate the external colony broadcast." Alpha pointed to a small, heavily shielded communications terminal near the main viewport. That terminal uses high-band military encryption. Only a trauma surgeon briefed on biocontainment failures would have the keys to bypass the final colonial filter. You, my architect of cruelty, will execute the final transmission. K felt a wave of icy sickness. He hadn't just armed Alpha. He was now required to provide the signature for the final genocide. "If I refuse," K ground out, his voice tight, fighting the pain and the humiliation. Alpha smiled, a wide, unnerving gesture that didn't touch his eyes. "You don't refuse. I have 22 disposable assets who will enjoy removing the restraints and spending a few minutes being creative. If you choose that, the broadcast goes out anyway and you die slowly, having achieved nothing. If you cooperate, you get a clean shot at the ghost lock before the countdown hits 0. Your choice, K. Execution in silence or execution in confession." K stared at his own hands, visible in the console reflection. The tremor was back, violent and debilitating. The MD5 had been taken. His last tool, his last path to action, was gone. He finally understood the depth of his failure. He hadn't been fighting for the colony or for Alpha's soul. He had been fighting for the lie, the belief that his demotion, his pain, and his forced service had somehow earned him moral credit. I am not choosing execution over murder, Kay thought, the brutal self-judgment finally settling in. I am choosing the lie over the truth, because I am terrified of accepting that my life's biggest failure created this monster. He closed his eyes, inhaling the thick, psychotropic-laced air. The agonizing realization was complete. Why continue? Why fight a battle that was already lost, using principles that had long been rendered obsolete? He had failed his patient, failed his superiors, failed the colony, and now he was about to sign the death warrant for thousands to protect a system that had already ruined him. It would be easier to just stop. A tired voice whispered in his mind. Let them kill me now. Let Alpha broadcast the truth. Let the universe consume us all. But the image of the Meridian colony, a peaceful beacon of light in the viewport, held his gaze. He couldn't choose surrender, not because he was a hero, but because he was too much of a surgeon to stop the work before the heart flatlined. Release my restraints, Kay stated, his voice a low rasp. I will execute the broadcast protocol. Alpha's smile widened, a confirmation of victory. N7 Epsilon disengaged the high tensile cuffs, but Kay's muscles, strained by the fight and the chemical acceleration, screamed in protest. He leaned heavily on the console, trying to steady his shaking hands. Kay was directed to the isolated communications terminal. He initiated the Level 7 trauma clearance, the console accepting the biometric input instantly. The screen flashed green, granting access to the core communication protocols. As he began inputting the data sequence for the final broadcast, Alpha dictating the chemical composition of the neurotoxin and the history of the Reaper program, Kay's surgical training took over, isolating his mind from the horror of the task. He focused on the screen, on the precise movements of his fingers. And then he saw it. Buried deep in the terminal's peripheral diagnostics, a section Vedra would never check and Alpha had clearly overlooked, was a small, almost invisible data feed, the TDS-9 surgical trauma link. It was an archaic, specialized interface designed for emergency neurosurgery on critical personnel, linking directly to the ship's most powerful exterior antenna, the Krell Deep Space Sensor Array. Kay knew why it was there. During initial design, Vedra's predecessor insisted on a medical failsafe, a way to remotely operate neuroregulation on critical personnel during deep space operations, using the massive antenna power supply to drive the surgical micro-tools. The power surge potential was immense, enough to fry a human surgeon on contact, but enough to broadcast a signal across systems. Kay's mind raced. Alpha only needed him for the colonial broadcast, authenticating the truth for the colonists. Alpha had missed the one terminal that could talk to the enemy. It was the smallest chance. A suicidal, almost cosmic gamble. If Kay diverted the terminal's energy and forced a transmission through the Krell sensor array, he wouldn't just be sending a simple warning. He would be using the ship's highest power output to transmit an omnidirectional burst directly into the Krell observation bands, alerting the entire nearby Krell fleet to the presence and exact location of the transport vessel. He would be saving the Meridian colony from Alpha's immediate genocide, but guaranteeing the destruction of the ship, the Reapers, himself, and potentially the colony. By inviting the concentrated fury of the Krell, he was trading internal intimate destruction for external total war. De mal en pire. From bad to worse. This was the logical, horrible conclusion to that phrase. Alpha finished dictating the final line of the broadcast, and the final realization that humanity's salvation was predicated on its greatest crime. Execute, Doctor, Alpha commanded. Kay's finger hovered over the transmit key. Instead, his left hand, moving beneath the console line, executed a complex 5-key bypass sequence on the TDS-9 interface, overriding the surgical failsafes. The terminal hummed dangerously. He had seconds. If Alpha noticed the power surge, he would be instantly vaporized. Kay looked at the Krell Deep Space Sensor reading on the peripheral diagnostic screen. A single massive Krell battle group was 18 hours away. Kay didn't think about the long-term consequences. He didn't think about the Krell. He focused only on preventing Alpha's immediate personalized atrocity against the innocence of Meridian. He slammed his hand down, not on the transmit key for the colony broadcast, but on the manual power shunt for the TDS-9. The ship did not explode. It screamed. The power surge was instantaneous and catastrophic. The bridge lighting exploded, plunging the command center into total darkness, followed by the sputtering return of the crimson emergency glow. The noise was deafening. A high-pitched electronic shriek coupled with the massive physical roar of the Krell sensor array powering up to maximum, transmitting K's forced signal into the deep void. N1 Alpha, thrown back by the energy pulse, staggered to his feet, rage twisting his calm features. "What did you do, K?" "I changed the target," K whispered, leaning against the smoking console, his ears ringing and his skin feeling cooked from the proximity to the raw power surge. The Krell sensor array transmission lasted only 3 seconds before the entire subsystem overloaded and detonated with a concussive blast in the hull, silencing the roar. But the signal was sent. The Krell knew they were here. The code Cassandra timer, which had been counting down, stopped completely, replaced by a flashing, violent red override. Detonation sequence initiated. Manual override intrusion detected. K's forced transmission had shorted the main control hub. Code Cassandra wasn't canceled, it was accelerated. Alpha laughed, a sound of pure psychotic delight. "You chose total war. Beautiful, Doctor. But you also shorted the power grid. Now you have no control at all." Suddenly the bridge was filled not with the sound of alarms, but with a rapid, echoing rhythmic thudding. The 22 Reapers surrounding them, driven by the surge and the sudden shock, began beating their high-tensile restraints against the deck plates. A synchronized, deafening drum circle of chemically driven madness. K looked down at the console. The emergency power supply had routed to the only remaining functional system, the central containment unit of the 22 remaining Reapers. N1 Alpha, still grinning, pointed past K, toward the viewport. "Look, Doctor. The Meridian colony is safe for now, but now we have a deadline. The Krell will be here in hours, and I still control the only power source on this broken ship." K followed Alpha's gaze. The main terminal, which was completely dead, sputtered back to life, displaying a single, chilling countdown, counting down from 60 minutes. Not the detonation sequence. The final life support battery capacity for the 22 Reapers. Alpha hadn't just taken the bridge. He had forced K to choose between total silence, Cassandra, and massive escalation, Krell. Now facing the Krell threat, Alpha still held the ultimate leverage, the lives of his 22 chemically unstable, hyper-accelerated troops. "Now, Doctor," Alpha purred, stepping closer, holding the MD-5 K had dropped. "You need me to survive the Krell. And I need you to keep my army operational for the final confrontation. We are partners in this beautiful, terrible failure. And your price, K, is to use your surgical brilliance to keep the 22 Reapers alive long enough to die fighting my enemy." K looked at the smoking terminal, his broken leg searing with pain, and the rhythmic drumming of 22 sociopaths waiting for their final chemical injection. His failure was not just complete, it was now essential for survival. He had saved the colony from himself, only to become the lead surgeon for the opposing army. The rhythmic thudding of the high-tensile restraints against the deck plates, the synchronized drum circle of Alpha's chemically driven army, replaced the alarms as the primary sound of the command deck. It was not chaos. It was order enforced by accelerated psychosis. K leaned against the console, trying to ignore the searing, throbbing pain in his shattered leg and the faint, permanent tremor in his hands. Code Cassandra was screaming now, a high-frequency internal wail indicating catastrophic acceleration toward zero. But Alpha ignored it, focusing entirely on K. "The clock is arbitrary, Doctor," Alpha stated, his voice calm, holding the MD-5 neurodisruptor loosely in his left hand, the weapon of paralysis now serving as a symbol of control. "Vedra wanted silence. You chose noise. Now we face the Krell, and they are not interested in moral debates. They only understand efficacy. I have the assets, you have the knowledge. The final transaction is simple: stabilization for survival. K felt the brutal logic of it cut through his pain. Alpha didn't need forgiveness or victory over K, he needed utility. K's modified protocol, meant to accelerate death, had now created a biological dependency so volatile that only the surgeon who initiated it could manage it. His greatest professional failure was now the only thing keeping the 22 human bombs from detonating internally, wiping out the bridge and Alpha's army. The emergency battery is routed only to the main containment nexus, K rasped, accepting the terms with a nauseating finality. 60 minutes of life support. We need to shunt power immediately. I can't stabilize them on residual charge. Alpha nodded, pleased by the clinical tone. Good. The trauma specialist returns. Focus, doctor. The containment nexus is in the aft quadrant, section Gamma 4. You need to physically access the power conduit, but the bridge system locks are down. We are running blind. If I go, K countered, pushing off the console, testing the weight on his unbroken leg. You disable Code Cassandra entirely. That countdown is a distraction, and it risks vaporization before the Krell arrive. If we survive on your terms, not Vedra's. Alpha's eyes narrowed, weighing the vengeance against the tactical advantage. He wanted to broadcast the truth, but the Krell offered a far grander spectacle of consequence. I accept, Alpha stated, his voice sharp. But I will be watching your internal telemetry. Any attempt to use surgical access for sabotage and N7 Epsilon detaches your good leg. Understood? K nodded once, a gesture of bleak acceptance. The irony was suffocating. He was being allowed to live and operate only by accepting total moral subjugation to the monster he had helped create. His failure was not just his greatest strength, it was his chains. K grabbed a minimal surgical kit, scalpel, high-tensile polymer thread, and a handful of microregulators, and began the agonizing journey through the damaged vessel. The journey to Section Gamma 4, usually a 3-minute sprint, took K 15 minutes of searing, desperate movement. He moved like a broken machine, dragging his shattered thigh, relying on the cold, hard memory of the ship's schematics. The air was colder here, close to the breached hull, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and leaking coolant. He found the containment nexus access panel. It was a dense web of high-power conduits, sparking intermittently, radiating a dangerous heat. He couldn't just bypass the power shunt, he had to physically bridge the energy flow from the battery to the main regulation unit. He opened his surgical kit. He wasn't performing surgery on a body, but on a power grid, using the precision of microsutures and fine steel tools to handle raw electrical current. Action concrete. He selected a heavy-gauge ceramic insulated cable, meant for emergency vascular bypass. K, report. Alpha's voice crackled from the handheld comms K had taken. The sound of the rhythmic drumming was still audible, slightly distorted. Code Cassandra is at T-minus 90 seconds. Expedite. K ignored the physical clock and focused only on the circuit. The first incision with the scalpel into the primary conduit insulation had to be perfect, shallow enough not to short the line, deep enough to expose the core wire. His hands were shaking. The residual tremor from the fight and the shock of his shattered leg made the fine motor control almost impossible. This is the failure, the voice of his past whispered. Lack of control, lack of precision. But then, the memory of his patient, N1 Alpha, unstable and convulsing under his failed attempt at neurological repair, flashed in his mind. K remembered the moment he gave up, accepting the demotion, letting Vedra take the patient and weaponize him. That moment of moral surrender had been his ultimate failure of precision. K took a breath, accepting the pain in his leg, accepting the tremor. He didn't fight the shaking. Instead, he integrated it. He used the constant low-frequency oscillation of the tremor to keep the scalpel moving, preventing a static, fatal slip. It was a messy, ugly incision, the opposite of his elegant past work. But it was functional. He used his failure to achieve his goal. He connected the bypass cable, his fingers burning from the residual heat. The moment the connection locked, the ship plunged into darkness again. "Kay!" Alpha's voice was a roar of fury. "Stabilization complete," Kay gasped, ignoring the shock and the sudden surge of pain as the magnetic field of the conduit pulsed. "Power successfully shunted. Regulation is now active. I have 30 minutes of full capacity before the battery bleeds dry." A moment of heavy silence, broken only by the continued terrifying drumbeat of the Reapers. Alpha had lost control of the light, but gained control of his army's life support. "Return to the bridge, Doctor," Alpha commanded, the fury replaced by cold calculus. "We have new constraints. Code Cassandra timer is locked at 47 seconds. I cannot fully disable it from here. It requires physical override at the ghost lock." Kay staggered back toward the bridge. He knew what Alpha was doing. Kay was now essential but still disposable. Alpha needed Kay to be the one to physically deal with Code Cassandra, while he secured the rest of the ship. He reached the bridge, favoring his unbroken leg, the sweat on his brow cold. Alpha stood waiting, framed by the chilling view of the Meridian colony. 42 seconds, Kay. The ghost lock is through that junction. Alpha indicated the corridor leading back to the aft engineering section. "If you fail, we all vaporize. If you succeed, we fight the Krell. Your choice. Your final surgical intervention." Kay didn't move immediately. He looked past Alpha, toward the array of Reaper assets, drumming their furious rhythm. He knew the risks of the ghost lock. If he went there, Alpha could detonate him instantly, securing the ship and ending the partnership if the Krell threat seemed too risky. Kay looked at Alpha. Alpha was smiling, a genuine, unsettling expression of admiration. "The ultimate moral quandary, Doctor. We die together, or we fight together and die later. Which is the greater service?" "We fight," Kay stated, not out of heroism, but out of necessity. Kay finally accepted that his role was not to save humanity's soul, but simply to mitigate the scale of its impending disaster. He turned and limped toward the ghost lock corridor. The drumming of the Reapers reached a fever pitch, their chemical anticipation feeding the tension. As he reached the junction, Alpha's voice cut through the air, softer now, laced with a final cutting insight. "Kay, listen. You always hesitated to pay the full price. That is why you failed me and why Vedra demoted you. But you just chose total war over guaranteed silence. You chose action over morality. You've changed, Doctor. You've become pragmatic." Kay paused, his broken leg searing. "You mistake pragmatism for acceptance. I accept what I am now, and what you are." He entered the ghost lock chamber. The interface was sputtering, radiating the latent energy of the Cassandra charge. 30 seconds remaining. Kay had disabled the lock before, but only partially. Now, with the charge critical, he had to perform the final, total severing of the main power line, a process that would release an explosive discharge of energy. He reached for the heaviest shear in his kit. The steel was cold against his hand. He placed the shear around the thick conduit, aiming for the perfect clean snap. He squeezed, ignoring the blinding flash of pain from his leg. The conduit fought back, resisting the pressure. Kay pushed harder, the muscles in his good arm screaming in protest. T-minus 20 seconds. The conduit snapped with a terrifying wet sound. A blinding sheet of white energy erupted from the severed line, bathing the compartment in raw power. Kay instinctively threw himself backward, shielding his face with his arm. The energy struck his side, slamming him into the cold metal wall. The air filled with the sharp stench of ionized metal and burned flesh. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, the sound of the blast replaced by a deep, constant ringing in his ears. He checked the terminal. Code Cassandra was dead. Completely, irrevocably disconnected from the power source. The threat of internal, immediate detonation was gone, but the cost was immediate. The white flash had permanently seared the nerve endings along the left side of his body. He wouldn't die from it, but the constant, agonizing feedback was now a part of his reality. Kay pushed himself up, staggering back into the bridge. The silence was unnerving. The rhythmic drumming of the Reapers had stopped. Alpha was standing, staring at the main viewport. The 60-minute timer for the Reaper life support battery capacity was still counting down. "You severed it," Alpha said, not turning, his voice flat. "Complete. Total surgical elimination of the containment protocol. Well done, Doctor." Kay leaned on a console, watching the Meridian colony glow innocently below. The Reapers stopped drumming. "They are waiting for their final dose," Alpha replied. "The last injection before deployment against the Krell. 30 minutes of peak operational efficiency, Doctor. Then they will begin their systemic collapse." Alpha finally turned, holding out the MD5 neurodisruptor. "Handle first. We need to get to the deployment bay. Your broken body, my brain, and their fury. We have approximately 4 hours until the Krell arrive in force. You saved us from ourselves, Kay. But in doing so, you have guaranteed our final, horrific purpose." Kay looked at the weapon of paralysis, then at the markers of the 22 men he was now obliged to keep alive for their final suicide mission. He had achieved the impossible. He had averted internal mass murder by choosing external, guaranteed self-immolation. He took the neurodisruptor. It was heavy, a tool of final control. "You had the chance to end it quietly, Alpha," Kay said, his voice raw, struggling to accept the agonizing new reality of his scorched nerves and shattered bone. Alpha's smile was chillingly sincere. "But where is the narrative in silence, Doctor? You wanted to save me once. I wanted to save the universe from the lie. We meet now in the middle ground, ensuring the final, undeniable truth of our shared failure is witnessed by the Krell. You became the surgeon of chaos. I became the consequence." Kay didn't answer. He had won the battle for the colony's survival, but at the cost of his body, his moral standing, and his future. He was now tethered to Alpha, ensuring the weapons of Earth's atrocity were sharp enough for their final battle. He looked at the digital clock counting down the remaining minutes of life support. The pain in his leg, the constant burning sensation of the fried nerves, and the deep abiding knowledge that he had willingly become the chief medic for a biochemical time bomb. This was his victory. The only way forward was through the ultimate unforgivable crime, optimizing 22 sociopaths for a final glorious annihilation. Kei Narushima, the failed surgeon, accepted his final purpose. He had 4 hours to prepare his army for death. The 4 hours were not a countdown to survival, but a forced, agonizing ritual of preparation for death. Kei, moving on sheer chemical adrenaline and professional obligation, dragged his broken body through the damaged deployment bay. Alpha, unnervingly calm, stood sentinel, holding the neurodisruptor, providing light and dictating the precise chemical measurements. The air, thick with the scent of recycled fear and engineered mania, was the atmosphere of a trauma theater run by a mad god. Kay performed 22 separate, meticulous injections. His shattered leg radiated fire with every shift of weight, and the scorched nerves on his left side provided a constant, high-frequency whine of agony, but his hands, though trembling, moved with a focus born of absolute necessity. He was no longer a surgeon trying to save life. He was a chemist calibrating the perfect detonation. "Higher yield on N9 gamma, Doctor," Alpha commanded, his voice detached, watching the biological markers flash with violent gold. "We need maximum aerosolization upon kinetic trauma. Ensure the field density exceeds 700%. Kay did as he was told, flooding the man's system with the accelerated cocktail, pushing the assets past even the suicidal parameters of Vedra's original design. He wasn't prolonging their lives. He was compressing their utility. He looked at the faces of the Reapers, pale, sweating, eyes wide and focused inward on the synthetic fury consuming them, and saw not the monsters of Earth's prisons, but the ultimate expression of human cruelty, refined by his own failed hands. When the last injection was complete, Kay slumped against the cold steel of the final containment unit, his body entirely spent. "Finished," Kay rasped, tasting copper and ozone. 30 minutes of peak efficacy. They will burn hot, and they will collapse. Alpha nodded, a gesture of deep satisfaction. He checked the main viewport. The void was beginning to shimmer. The Krell battle group, alerted by K's desperate transmission, was decelerating into orbit. 4 minutes to deployment, Doctor, Alpha announced, his voice carrying the finality of a closing curtain. I require you back on the bridge to monitor the telemetry. You will be the sole witness to the effectiveness of your final protocol. K didn't argue. He knew the choreography of his end. He dragged himself back to the bridge. The view through the main port was terrifying. Massive angular Krell cruisers, far larger than any scout ships, were positioning themselves around the transport vessel. They weren't communicating. They were aiming. They had learned to neutralize the neurotoxin field with orbital plasma sweeps, but they hadn't anticipated the source of the fear targeting the vessel itself. Alpha positioned himself before the main deployment key. The Earth demanded silence. I demand truth, he stated, his cold eyes fixed on K. When they see 22 chemically perfect sociopaths detonate their final neurotoxin field, Central Command will know the price of their lie. They will never recover the assets. They will only salvage the failure. Alpha slammed his hand down on the deployment key. The deployment bay doors hissed open. 22 figures moving with unnatural grace and speed were ejected into the blackness toward the lead Krell ships. The markers flashed across K's display, gold turning violently white as they exceeded all possible exertion thresholds. The ensuing engagement was brief, brutal, and utterly silent in the vacuum. The Krell plasma sweeps came too late. The Reapers achieved their objective, saturating the immediate area with aerosolized panic, before they were vaporized by retaliatory fire or their own internal systemic collapse. The white markers vanished from the screen in rapid succession, followed by the deep red smear of cascading Krell ship failures as their crews succumbed to sudden neurotoxic shock. The Meridian colony was safe. The Krell advance had been momentarily crippled, its immediate assault capabilities shattered by the wave of weaponized fear. Alpha looked at the empty screen, at the clean slate of the tactical display. The Krell cruisers, though battered, were already regrouping, turning their heavy guns on the crippled transport vessel. They knew the source of the plague. Mission successful, Alpha murmured, a strange sense of melancholy in his tone. Total elimination of assets, maximum output achieved. The data is secured. He turned to K, the neurodisruptor still dangling from his hand. Your utility is exhausted, Doctor. The debt is paid, and now the final silence. Alpha's finger drifted toward the ship's reactor overload sequence. He was going to ensure the entire vessel, the data, and the final witnesses were vaporized, leaving nothing for Vedra or the Krell. K pushed off the console, ignoring the screaming pain in his leg and the burning in his side. He didn't move to fight. He moved to assist. He reached the dead communications terminal, the one he had used to send the desperate signal to the Krell, and initiated the final power bleed protocol, routing all residual energy into the main reactor. It was a redundant system, but it would ensure the core detonated faster, cleaner, leaving less debris. Alpha watched him, a flash of surprise, the emotion K had lost 30 seconds into deployment, crossing his face. You're helping me? Alpha asked, disbelief warring with admiration. I accept the cost, K stated, his voice flat. But I choose the method. Clean obliteration over a slow execution at the hands of Earth's cleanup crew. Alpha nodded slowly, lowering the neurodisruptor. A surgeon's final choice, precision over mercy. I thank you, K. Narushima. You were never meant for morality, only for efficacy. Alpha pressed the reactor overload sequence. A deep, heavy hum began to rise from the ship's core, a vibration that promised finality. The lights on the bridge turned to pure, intense white, flooding the compartment with sterile, blinding light. K didn't look at Alpha. He didn't look at the incoming Krell fire that was already starting to batter the hull. He looked only at the main viewport, at the innocent blue-white sphere of the Meridian colony, saved by the unforgivable crime. The light intensified, washing out all color, all detail. The hum became a deafening roar, tearing at his eardrums. He felt the structure of the bridge begin to melt around him. The light, too intense, burned the smell of recycled air and psychotropics from his senses. Kei Narushima, waiting for the end, finally understood his purpose. Not salvation, not judgment, just maintenance. Keeping the horrible truth alive just long enough for it to self-destruct. He didn't fight the consuming heat or the rising sound. He accepted the finality of the cleansing process, the obliteration of his body, the silence of his secret. Kei Narushima, the surgeon of failure, felt no surprise, just the final permanent silence. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.